Welcome back to PSIND. And today's episode is about a race that tells you a lot more than just who won and who lost. But on paper, it was Kentucky Republican primary between Thomas Massie and Ed Gallrein. But in reality, this race became a window into something much bigger. Outside influence, Trump world politics, pro-Israel alignment, and the way different generations responded to political messaging. Because when a race like this gets national attention, it stops being just a local contest and it becomes a test case. A test of how much donor money can move a primary. A test of how powerful an endorsement really is. A test of whether voters are still choosing candidates based on independence, or whether they're choosing the candidate who fits better inside the political machine. Thomas Massie has built his brand around being independent. He's the kind of Republican who doesn't always play by the party script, and that makes him appealing to some voters and frustrating to others. Ed Gallrein, on the other hand, by contrast, was the challenger who benefited from a much broader political push, one that tied him more closely to Trump's orbit and the larger force structure surrounding the race. And that matters because once Trump enters the picture, the race becomes bigger than Kentucky. It becomes about loyalty. It becomes about alignment. It becomes about whether the Republican base wants someone who challenged the system or someone who reflects it. But this race wasn't just about Trump backing one side. It was about the larger world of influence that surrounds modern politics. The donor networks, the media narratives, the political alliances, and the issues, positions that shape how people see a candidate before they ever look at the ballot. That includes the pro-Israel side of the conversation too. Trump's strong support for Israel has long been one of the defining features of his political identity. Now, however, when he first ran, he said nothing about taking AIPAC money. Let's just get that 1,000% clear. But this term, he took a lot of AIPAC money, and it seems like, in honesty, he's owned by Israel. And that broader alignment matters in a race like this because it sits inside the bigger story of influence and power. When people talk about the forces shaping races like Massie and Gallrein, they're not just talking about campaign ads, they're talking about the political environment around that candidate. So that's the first layer of this story. The second layer is the voting pattern itself. Because the age breakdown in this race tells its own story, and it's a story that truly matters. Massie performed strongly with younger voters in the 18 to 29 group. He led 78.5% to 21.5%. Among voters 30 to 44, he was still ahead, 64.9% to 35.1%. Even in the 45 to 64, he held a narrow lead at 53%. But then the race changes completely with voters 65 and older, Fox News watchers. Gallrein led the group 65% to 35%. That's not a small detail. That's the part of the race that tells you where the break really happened. It shows that Massie's support was real, but concentrated. He had the young votes. Gallrein had the older ones. And in a primary, that kind of split can decide everything. So what does that mean? It means the race was not just about personality. It was not just about messaging. And it was not about who had the bigger headline or the louder supporters. It was about whether one side could build a coalition broad enough to overcome the other side's strong base. And that's where the generational piece becomes so important. Young voters tend to respond differently to politics than older voters do. They're often more open to candidates who seem independent, more skeptical of traditional power structures, and more willing to back someone who sounds like they're not standing apart from the machine. Older voters, on the other hand, often respond more strongly to familiar political signals, party alignment, and the kind of messaging that reinforces what they already trust. That doesn't mean every older voter thinks the same way, of course not, but in a race like this, the aggregate trend matters, and the aggregate trend was clear. Massie owned the young vote, Gallrein owned the older vote, and the oldest bloc gave Gallrein the advantage he needed. And once you combine that with the broader influence story, and the race becomes even more interesting, because now you're just not looking at age, you're looking at how outside pressure, Trump's endorsement, and the larger political environment interacted with those age divisions. That's what makes this race so revealing. It shows how modern politics are rarely won by one factor alone. They're won when several factors line up at the same time. A candidate can have a strong appeal with one demographic and still lose if the opposing candidate locks down another group that turns out more reliably. A candidate can have an independent brand and still lose if the opposition has more institutional power. A candidate can have a more powerful message and still lose if the coalition around him is too narrow. And that's really the lesson here, guys. This race tells you that influence in politics doesn't always work through one obvious channel. Sometimes it works through money, sometimes it works through endorsement, and sometimes it works through media environment. It works through the generational habits of voters who already trust one side more than the other. That's why the Massie-Gallrein primary got attention well beyond Kentucky. It wasn't just a local election result, it was a snapshot of how political power works right now. And Miriam Adelson. It showed the tension between independence and loyalty, between youth and age, between local identity and national influence. And the reason people keep talking about it is because it fits a pattern where we see again and again. When a race becomes symbolic, the actual vote becomes about more than one seat. It becomes a statement. It becomes a verdict on what kind of politics the voters want and what kind of politics they're rejecting. And in this case, the verdict was clear enough. Massie had the young votes, Gallrein had the older votes. Trump's orbit was a part of the larger picture, and so was the pro-Israel alignment. AIPAC spent more than I think I read this morning, it was $35 million for funding for Ed Gallrein. That is the most for any congressional seat of all time. All time. In a seat where Thomas Massie votes 91% of the time with Republicans. Because Thomas Massie wanted one thing. He wanted to expose pedophiles. He wanted to not have us killing our own citizens with bad chemicals. So if you want the simplest version of the takeaway, it's this. This race was about power. Power from the outside, power from endorsements, power from national politics, and power from generational divisions, and power from the fact that elections are increasingly shaped by networks and not just candidates. Massie showed that there is still energy behind independence. Gallrein showed that the older, more traditional, more aligned bloc can still win when it turns out. And together they turned one primary into a case study in how modern politics really works. If there's one thing this race makes clear, it's that the divide inside the Republican Party isn't just ideological, it's generational, it's strategic, and it's about who listens to what, who trusts what, and who shows up when it matters. That's all I have for this one, but I want to take a second and Thomas Massie has been big for me as an independent for years because he's always fought issues, and that was even when Biden was in, and now with Trump, which I think in the end of the day, this country especially needs to realize that most Trump-endorsed candidates, even in our own town, are affiliated with Israel. And some people can swallow that, and that's fine. But the other people like me, don't see the advantages to living pro-Israel. I'm not anti-Semitic. I'm not saying anything along those lines. I just don't understand the principle between the two. That's today's episode of PSIND, and I'll drop another one on Sunday or Monday. I'm not sure yet. But yeah, last thing I gotta say is Massie 2028. Peace.